What can explain the sudden appearance of a phenomenon such as school shootings in a territory where it was previously uncommon? How can it be explained other than by outside interference? After all, what has changed in Russia since the times when such crimes were unheard of? What has changed is that anti-cultism has gained unprecedented power and influence here. Today, Russian media deliberately spreads the narrative that the cause of mass school shootings in Russia is the influence of similar incidents in the United States. To implant this idea in the masses, the same image of such a crime, Columbine, is most often used. In news reports about school shootings in Russia, you will frequently find a parallel drawn specifically with the Columbine case.
What happened at the Moscow school is being called the American scenario by the Russian press. Incidents like this do indeed happen often in the U.S.
School shootings are common in the U.S., but not in Russia.
Shootings and hostage situations are indeed not uncommon in American schools. A student or former student with a rifle in hand, that's the typical anti-hero of local news.
However, as I mentioned earlier, the first instance of such supposed imitation in Russia occurred in 2017, 18 years after the Columbine events. Why did it take so long for the first imitator to appear in Russia? The answer is simple. Because it's not just imitation. Someone allowed this precedent to happen in Russia and ensured it received widespread publicity. Some Russian propaganda figures, authors, and proponents of the theory alleging the harmful influence of the USA on school shootings in Russia claim that these incidents are characterized by organized activity, supposedly initiated by the US. This argument is supported by a simple propaganda narrative. It is so because historically, the US has always been opposed to Russia on the geopolitical stage. Therefore, America is an enemy, and in this way, the enemy is attacking Russia. However, logically thinking, it is the United States itself that suffers much more from school shootings. Why? Why would they attack themselves? It would be more logical to assume that America suffers the most precisely because its adversaries subject it to massive and regular attacks. The truth is that both the American and Russian peoples are subjected to cynical and sophisticated attacks from their common enemy, global anti-cultism. By trying to divert attention and shift all the blame onto the allegedly bad example set by the United States, the hidden shadow force, who is the ideological mastermind of anti-cultism and terrorism, intended to create a visible image of an enemy, obscuring its own tracks behind mass shootings in both Russia and America, behind the Columbine tragedy and the phenomenon of school shootings as a whole. Today, the threat of school shootings in Russia has become a serious societal issue.
At least 13 people are dead, including at least 7 children, after a shooting at a school in central Russia. In Russia, a gunman killed at least 15 people at a school today, 11 of them children.
Close the door. Some shooting! I hope they'll shoot him.
Hey, buddy, hang in there.
Hold on a bit, okay?
We'll tie it up quickly.
Guys, it's a complete mess. I'm done. I'm in Perm State University. It's a complete mess here. The situation right now is people are being loaded into ambulances. There are the wounded everywhere. I wanted to get my child out, but the best thing for them now is to barricade. They're there.
To explain how this phenomenon suddenly emerged and began to progress, one needs to trace the consequences these terrorist acts brought to the country. What was the political situation at the time of the attack? What changes did this event provoke in that situation? What laws were passed after each new high-profile case? And who ultimately benefited from this, implementing their selfish goals under the guise of a loud news break? Then it becomes evident that the reason for the emergence of school shootings in Russia is not spontaneous copycats. It is simply that the force behind anti-cultism has decided to use this tool of terror now on Russian soil as well. Another confirmation that school shootings are not accidental is the geography of these attacks. Notice that there are specific countries, like the United States, that regularly suffer from school shootings. Then, there are countries where this phenomenon is gaining momentum, like Russia. And there are countries where only isolated incidents have occurred without subsequent recurrences, such as Canada or some European countries.
Breaking news out of Canada, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says 5 people have been killed, 2 more are in critical condition after a school shooting.
A 14-year-old boy has shot dead 8 children at a school in Serbia.
These cases generally did not receive widespread media coverage or gain worldwide notoriety. Many of you, I am sure, are hearing about these incidents for the first time today. And then there are other countries with a myriad of social problems and factors that seem likely to provoke such incidents. Yet, they have never experienced a single school shooting. It's as if some invisible force is protecting them from this. Suppose the cause of school shootings is presumably the uncontrolled imitation of shooters by teenagers. Why does this principle not apply in these countries? This simply indicates that either the representatives of anti-cultism do not yet have their levers of influence in these countries, or it is not yet advantageous for them to carry out such attacks there. However, this does not guarantee that these countries' populations are protected from such crimes. A vivid example is the previously mentioned mass shooting incident in the Czech Republic in 2023.
Breaking news out of Prague, where police say 15 people are dead and dozens injured after a shooting at Charles University. The gunman.
This event occurred during a period of growing dissatisfaction among the population with the political situation in the country and an economic crisis caused by sanctions imposed by the Czech Republic against Russia. Notably, in this situation, the media began actively circulating information that the Czech shooter allegedly cited as his motivation the example of a female shooter from Russia who had carried out an armed attack at a school just a few weeks before these events. Such a confluence of circumstances suggests that the attack in the Czech Republic was not coincidentally carried out at this particular time, nor was the reference to Russia as the inspiration for the crime accidental. It appears that someone wanted to exploit the situation for their own interests. If we examine each such attack closely, we can see that these events always correlate with the political situation in the victim country. For example, they often coincide with upcoming elections, important international negotiations, escalating political tensions within the country, growing public dissatisfaction with the government, and so on. Such events often become significant and high-profile news stories that overshadow other news. During this period, when public attention is focused on the tragedy, anti-cult representatives and the forces behind them can quietly carry out actions they would prefer to keep out of the public eye. Are these coincidences or someone's cold calculation? The most telling evidence of the planned nature of these attacks is their influence both on the life of a single country and on the global community. Each school shooting brings about a series of political and social transformations directed by anti-cult representatives to serve their interests. This leads to significant changes within the state and irreversibly affects the lives of its people. Even one such event leaves an unhealing, bleeding wound on the heart of the entire society. Primarily, such terrorist attacks target parents and all those with children. After all, a terror attack where one child kills other children causes immense shock and upheaval in society. It strikes at the most vulnerable place in every parent, for their life.
Waited hours to be told our daughter would never come home.
The sensationalized details of school shootings spread through the media create a powerful internal fear in people, creating a pervasive sense of constant threat to the lives of their children.
There's no place that's safe anymore, and our public schools should be the safest.
Everyone who's a parent feels that.
This makes no sense.
This is impossible. My girl, my 14-year-old baby, I sent her to school yesterday. What is unfathomable is Jamie took a bullet and is dead.
We don't feel safe, and we want it to be addressed.
Schools are not safe anymore.
At the same time, a clear belief forms among the population the government cannot protect our children.
How dare you? You were paid by them, and you just came out and, what was that, a deposition?
I'm tired. I'm so tired of getting up here and offering condolences.
Therefore, with each new incident, distrust and dissatisfaction with the authorities will only increase.
This is America. We were supposed to be able to do things and be the people we wanted to be, and now we're in a crazy place.
Since we survived a mass shooting in July, I have met with over 130 lawmakers. How is this still happening? How are our children still dying, and why are we failing them?
How do we allow a gunman to come into our children's school? How do they get through security? What security is there? There's no metal detectors. The gunman, a crazy person, just walks right into the school, knocks down the window of my child's door, and starts shooting her.
In the eyes of frightened parents, the authorities are guilty of failing to ensure their children's safety. They are guilty of allowing their children to live in a state that is rotting from within, where their child could become a victim at any moment or even turn into a perpetrator. This subconscious understanding causes feelings of apathy, hopelessness, and hatred towards the current authorities, skillfully inflamed by anti-cult representatives.
This doesn't happen in other countries. It happens in the United States of America.
You've got a beautiful country, you've got beautiful people, but what's the problem? Guns. How does a 7-year-old have a gun?
I'm very angry that this happened, because it keeps happening.
These children survived. This is the shrill screaming of kids trying to get out while their classmates are being murdered.
The phenomenon is that people are artificially instilled with hatred towards any authority in general. Conditions are created that show people that no matter who they elect or place in power, nothing changes. Thus, the belief that all authority is evil becomes firmly rooted in the public consciousness. This process creates a vicious cycle. Artificially induced and maintained fear drives part of the population to demand stricter measures and tougher laws from the authorities. However, these initially well-intentioned initiatives that were supposed to prevent new crimes are subsequently used by anti-cult representatives and their accomplices within state structures against the people themselves. This results in greater subjugation of the populace, increased control over citizens' lives, and the suppression of free speech. Thus, people are gradually stripped of their last rights and freedoms. As a consequence, a previously democratic country moves closer to a totalitarian regime. But at the same time, while one part of the population, driven by fear, advocates for stricter measures, another part, driven by hatred towards the authorities, believes that such authoritarian methods will lead to even greater restrictions on their freedoms and violations of their rights.
Students, parents, and activists gathered outside Tennessee State's Capitol to protest gun violence.
The government would just do something to keep people from getting guns they don't need. It's unnecessary.
To change who is in government.
Wrong-headed leaders who prioritize guns over children.
My gun sits right here on my side and doesn't jump out and shoot anybody.
Gun violence. In a school that allows teachers to carry
guns? You think more guns lead to more death?
The main point in this situation is that anti-cult representatives, through precise and sophisticated manipulations, artificially destabilize and divide society. This causes a split into two opposing camps. Thus, a large mass of people forms, who hate the authorities and hate each other. What will this lead to? Unrest, protests, and confrontation. All of this collectively puts the country on the brink of civil war. And this is precisely the final point to which global anti-cultism and the hidden shadow force behind it are currently leading America. This is why mass shootings in schools occur so frequently in the United States. This process is planned and controlled. It is part of the enemy's strategy aimed at destroying democracy, first in the US, and then throughout the world. It is a complex but highly effective scheme carried out by global anti-cult representatives right before the world's eyes, yet unnoticed by anyone. It's worth adding that despite the apparent chaos in the spread of news about these incidents or narratives glorifying the shooters, anti-cult representatives carefully ensure that the information, tainted with their manipulative virus, is delivered precisely and in measured doses. This is to prevent school attacks from becoming too widespread. Excessive numbers of such crimes would diminish their impact, and each subsequent incident would no longer provoke such a strong societal reaction. People are capable of becoming accustomed to anything, even such horrific events. If school shootings happen too frequently, society will eventually adapt. While these events will still induce fear, the constant internal anxiety and worry will diminish. People will remain cautious, but not much more. On the other hand, measured instances of crime open people's minds to the implantation of negatively acting images that go straight into the subconscious, which most people today cannot defend against. Statistics are stubborn things, and they speak for themselves. These attacks' periodicity and growth trends clearly point to the hidden organizers behind this phenomenon. The situation in the U.S. is particularly alarming, with a rapid increase in school shootings carrying a hidden warning sign. Initially, anti-cult representatives provoked isolated incidents of school shootings, which had a massive impact not only on America, but on the entire world.
School shooting, high school shooting,
These events were like bombs going off because, at the time, children shooting other children was an extraordinary occurrence that caused profound shock in society. Thus, the early incidents of school shootings in the U.S. became very loud informational terrorist attacks, shocking the whole world. The Columbine High School massacre alone had tragic repercussions for many, spawning new school shootings and significantly bolstering the influence of anti-cultism in the U.S. Now, look at what's happening in America today. The graphs showing the number of mass school shootings indicate a sharp increase. What does this signify? Due to the special role the U.S. plays in the hidden enemy's plans, it suggests that the upcoming events they have planned can lead to increased tension inside the country. By using school shootings as acts of informational terrorism and deploying various psychological and informational terrorist attacks through its numerous tentacles, this hidden force is preparing the ground for a future civil war. Therefore, people need to be aware of the methods the enemy employs through the global anti-cult network and the threats they pose. Only this way can people extricate themselves from the manipulative game into which anti-cult representatives have drawn them. It's crucial to recognize that no measures, no matter how strict, will eradicate the root cause of school shootings as long as the source of these terrorist attacks exists and there is someone to give the command start. After all, similar measures have already been taken in different countries around the world, which aligns with the goals of representatives of anti-cultism. However, practice has shown that neither the prospect of the death penalty, increased school security, nor restrictions on firearm purchases have reduced the incidence of school shootings. Even if a total ban on civilian gun ownership were enacted, future attacks will occur in other forms, such as homemade bombs, melee weapons, or poison gas. Similarly, the introduction of censorship on social networks and other additional measures to control youth behavior have also proven ineffective. Ultimately, all of this has only led to significant infringements on citizens' rights and freedoms and undermining democracy, without reducing the number of school shootings, let alone eliminating them, because all the strictest measures and restrictive laws enacted in response to these incidents are often initiated and implemented by global anti-cult representatives and their accomplices within politics, the state apparatus, the judiciary, and law enforcement. Therefore, a priori, they will always be designed to work against people and democracy. This chain of evil will not end, and children will continue to suffer and die as long as global anti-cultism exists and its representatives can freely use their hidden manipulative techniques to influence people's minds and conduct acts of informational terrorism through the media.
School shootings are the plague of the 21st century, and the source of this plague is global anti-cultism and the hidden enemy of humanity behind it. It is the creation of a force that skillfully manipulates images and has chosen terrorism as its primary weapon. They are responsible for creating this disease. They cultivate and sustain it. We can only defeat this disease when the true spreaders, all the perpetrators and organizers of these crimes, are held accountable and answer before all of humanity for their atrocities.
If anyone still doubts that representatives of anti-cultism are behind mass school shootings, let me give you a specific example. The details of the events I am about to discuss directly point to the original culprits of the Columbine High School massacre and the ideological architects of the phenomenon of school shootings as a whole.
Waco case.
As previously mentioned, one of the bloody episodes in the chain of the terrorist acts that caused mass shooting at the Columbine High School was the Waco siege. In the spring of 1993, tragic events took place as a result of which many people died, a horrible death. The Waco siege still remains a relevant, widely discussed and burning topic for many Americans. It is one of the most notorious events in U.S. history that has changed American society forever. To this day, it continues to have a significant influence on political and social life in the country. Despite numerous attempts by various researchers to get to the bottom of it, there are still many dark spots in this story, because all discussions, even those representing points of view of the opposing parties, are still being held according to a pattern set by representatives of anti-cult organizations 30 years ago. Today, for the first time ever, the real picture of events in Waco will be presented, and you'll be able to clearly see for yourselves how the threads from that terrorist attack lead straight to its instigators and final beneficiaries, to the very abode of anti-cultism, to Russia.
The Waco tragedy is a classic example of a premeditated public display of a religious organization persecution by anti-cultists, involving law enforcement agencies and other authorities, which turned into a powerful informational act of terrorism. In this case, the target of anti-cultists was the Branch Davidian religious group that represented an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. By the time of the discussed events, the Branch Davidian community that resided at Mount Carmel Ranch, near the city of Waco, Texas, had been peacefully existing for about 50 years. For a long time, the locals perceived them as a harmless group of positive people. However, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, through the efforts of representatives of anti-cult organizations, the derogatory word cult suddenly began to be used as regards the Branch Davidians, which is a classic first step by cult fighters in dehumanizing their chosen victim for subsequent persecution.
What was the Branch Davidians community like? They were a group of people peacefully living on their land, in a building they themselves had erected, and were united by joint study of the Bible. Each had their own hobbies, earned their living, just like everyone else, had various professions and came from various walks of life. Among them were Harvard graduates, rock musicians, as well as ordinary mothers caring for their children. There are many similar settlements across America. Those were free people who lived in a free country the way they liked, in accordance with Christian values and the U.S. Constitution. They didn't impose their lifestyle on anyone and didn't cause anyone harm.
I'm Paulina.
I'm Stephen.
I'm Vanessa. Philip.
Well, you had a bunch of women, children, elderly people. They were all good people. They had different beliefs from others, different beliefs than I have, or maybe different beliefs than you have in their way of life, and especially in their religious beliefs. But basically, they were good people. I was around them quite a lot. They were always nice, mannerly. They minded their own business. They were never overbearing. They were always clean and courteous. I liked them.
Several years before the tragic events, anti-cultists had launched a series of discrediting articles and videos in mass media aimed at the Branch Davidians. At that time, the community leader was a young preacher, Vernon Howell, who adopted a religious pseudonym, David Koresh. He became the main target of the attack of anti-cultists, who started labeling him as a dangerous cult leader through the media they controlled.
Even then, his enemies were saying this self-proclaimed son of God was closer to Satan.
Throughout the entire subsequent disinformation campaign, other members of the organization were deliberately ignored, and almost all of them remained nameless, devoid of individuality. Under the influence of anti-cultists, mass media presented the Davidians solely as those who had been brainwashed by their leader, who allegedly were almost in a slavish position and unconditionally followed Koresh's orders. A demonization campaign against Davidians was led by the already mentioned anti-cultist and deprogrammer, Rick Ross. He organized a group of people who purposefully engaged in demonizing this community. His group included some anti-cultists from the CAN network, former members of the Branch Davidians they recruited, relatives of those former members, as well as news reporters from a number of periodicals and presenters of popular TV programs. Let's recall that by the early 90s, CAN was the leading anti-cult organization in the USA, while Rick Ross was one of the most active deprogrammers in CAN. Also, a big role in discrediting the Davidians was played by their former member Mark Bro, who had left the community after a conflict with Koresh. Bro had obvious motives for a personal revenge. Starting from 1991, he gave a series of interviews where he unprovenly claimed, among other things, that Koresh abused children, and moreover, that he could even kill them using them as human victims. Bro also claimed that Koresh allegedly applied mind manipulation techniques to control members of his group and could order them to commit mass suicide. Later on, the anti-cult gang persistently tried to spread this narrative, sending a warning to their accomplices in mass media and the U.S. authorities under the guise of anonymous informants that the Davidians were allegedly planning to commit mass suicide. In their messages, anti-cultists asserted that Mount Carmel would become another Johnstown if measures weren't taken. Of course, these allegations had no ground or factual evidence other than rumors and slander spread by individuals whom anti-cultists recruited. The purpose of this campaign was to draw the attention of law enforcement agencies to the activities of the Branch Davidian community, and in order to do that, anti-cultists even resorted to outright lies.
Techniques that were used against Branch Davidians, such as stigmatization, dehumanization, and guilt by association, are classical methods in the strategy of anti-cultists, aimed at persecuting a target group in order to carry out an informational act of terrorism. The anti-cultists were actually the first to launch the narrative about a possible mass suicide of Davidians, and this very narrative played a decisive role in subsequent interpretation of the Waco tragedy outcome.
The events of 1993 began when the leader of the Branch Davidians, David Koresh, and other organization members were suspected of violating firearms laws. the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, initiated an investigation into the activities of this religious organization based on unverified information, or simply put, rumors, about the illegal possession of automatic weapons by its members. Who was actually the source of those rumors? In the summer of 1992, anti-cultist Rick Ross forcibly deprogrammed former Branch Davidians member David Block at the home of Priscilla Coates, who at that time was the national representative of the Cult Awareness Network, CAN. In the process of deprogramming, which is essentially physical and psychological torture, Rick Ross wrested information from Block about the weapons stored at Mount Carmel and conveyed it to ATF, where he had personal connections. According to the 1993 U.S. Department of the Treasury report on the ATF raid, the message about the weapons turned out to be inaccurate and was based almost entirely on the statement of a former Davidian member, David Block. During the investigation of ATF's actions, the Department of the Treasury later criticized the agency's excessive reliance on a single dubious source of information. It is worth noting that at that time, legal sales of firearms were a widespread business in Texas, and it was indeed one of the income sources for the Branch Davidians. Therefore, when federal ATF agents began to show interest in the Davidians' activities, the organization's leader, David Koresh, invited the agents to visit Mount Carmel and personally inspect the weapons and the relevant licenses. However, Agent Aguilera, assigned to the case, refused this offer for some reason. Subsequently, after setting up round-the-clock surveillance on the community members, Agent Aguilera managed to compile the necessary materials to obtain a search and arrest warrant based on the collected information. The investigation initiated by the U.S. Congress later found out that the ATF investigation had been gross and untenable, while the statement compiled by Aguilera contained numerous errors, distortions of facts, incorrect interpretations of the law, improper application of the law to the facts, as well as a great deal of incoherent and confusing information. In particular, Agent Aguilera's statement claimed that Koresh possessed a .52 caliber anti-tank rifle, which was a criminal offense. In reality, he owned a .50 caliber rifle, which was totally legal. That the Davidians had grenades, but it wasn't mentioned that the grenades had been legally purchased and that Davidians were selling them at gun shows as paperweights. The statement included references to the testimony of a deputy sheriff who reported hearing the sound of a powerful explosion coming from Mount Carmel. However, he failed to report that the sheriff had investigated and learned that the Davidians were using dynamite legally for construction. The source of exaggerated claims about illegal weapons, paramilitary training at Mount Carmel, 24-hour observation posts, commands to shoot any suspicious persons on sight, and alleged plans to wage war against the U.S. government was the previously mentioned former Davidian, Mark Bro, who had abandoned the community due to disagreements with Koresh. At the same time, the statement against the Davidians did not mention that this former member was blind. Yet it claimed he had been personally involved in physical training and firing practices conducted by Koresh, and had supposedly served as a guard, armed with combat weapons. Thus, ATF agent Aguilera initially maintained the case against Davidians based solely on the testimony of anti-cultists and their accomplices. Based on these falsified materials, a search warrant for the Mount Carmel Ranch, where the Davidian community resided, was issued on February 25, 1993. Role of mass media in the Waco tragedy. Simultaneously with preparing the ATF operation, anti-cultists launched an active campaign to discredit the Branch Davidians in mass media. Later on, a number of researchers noted the key role the media played in the tragic turn of the Waco events. It was actually accomplices of the anti-cult movement among the media who became the main broadcasters of the anti-cultists' dark rhetoric. Through their efforts, combined with the manipulative tactics of anti-cultists, an image of members of a dangerous and sinister cult was created out of innocent, law-abiding American citizens. members of the Branch Davidians. Consequently, it was through the prism of the unreliable and defamatory information presented by the media that society, law enforcement agencies, and government officials viewed the Davidians. A significant contribution thereto was made by a local newspaper, the Waco Tribune-Herald, which actively broadcasted baseless accusations initiated by the anti-cultists. At the time of the discussed events, almost simultaneously with the start of the law enforcement operation against the Davidians, the Waco Tribune-Herald released a series of articles titled "The Sinful Messiah." The first article was published on February 27, 1993, the day before the ATF raid. Reports by the article author, Mark England, heavily relied on the testimony of Bro, deprogrammer Rick Ross, and other key figures involved in the demonization campaign against the Davidians. At the same time, the author did not seek opinion from competent researchers specializing in studying such religious organizations. And even more so, the perspective of the Davidians and their leader was not represented either. Interestingly enough, until a certain point, reporters from the Waco Tribune-Herald covered information about the Branch Davidians neutrally, without using the offensive label of a cult. However, their rhetoric changed dramatically after the intervention of anti-cultists. England, the author of the Sinful Messiah series, began actively promoting anti-cult narratives portraying the 33-year-old Koresh as a fanatical cult leader who used mind control techniques on his followers. Mark England also accused him of polygamy and child abuse, and claimed that the leader of the Davidians engaged in sexual relations with underage female members.
There was really no evidence of child abuse. It was only allegations. And again, I say today that we have not ever found any proof of any child abuse out there.
At that time, no confirmed evidence supported such claims. The situation was quite the opposite. In fact, back in 1992, the Texas Child Protective Services, CPS, received an anonymous report alleging child abuse at Mount Carmel. Following the anonymous message, CPS staff visited Mount Carmel 3 times. They conducted physical examinations of 12 Davidian children, and the investigation found no signs of abuse or injury. Due to the lack of evidence supporting the child abuse allegations, CPS officials closed the investigation regarding Koresh. However, that didn't prevent ATF investigator David Aguilera from including child abuse accusations in his affidavit for a search and arrest warrant for Koresh. Aguilera, in turn, had received this information from Mark Bro. Later on, despite the fact that suspicions of child abuse by Koresh were not confirmed, they were still actively promoted in mass media controlled by the anti-cultists, which significantly influenced the decisions made by the operation commanders and representatives of the authorities. For some reason, even though there was no evidence, mass media and law enforcement officials treated accusations made by the anti-cultists and disseminated by their associates as irrefutable facts. The greatest influence on the law enforcement officers who prepared the Mount Carmel raid was exerted by anti-cultist and deprogrammer Rick Ross. In fact, Nancy Ammerman's report to the Departments of Justice and Treasury regarding the actions of federal law enforcement agencies in Waco stated that Rick Ross was, in fact, closely involved with both the ATF and the FBI, and that it was he who provided them and the Waco Tribune with misleading information about the Branch Davidians. Thus, both the search warrant and the ATF raid plan relied heavily on information provided by anti-cultists and their accomplices, rather than on factual materials. Starting from December 1992, 10 weeks before the federal raid against the Davidians, ATF and other federal agents increasingly turned to Mark Bro and Rick Ross for information and consultations. Specifically, Bro characterized the Davidians to federal agents as terrorists. He claimed that they were no ordinary group of criminals, but allegedly religious fanatics who wouldn't hesitate to suicide for their leader. Bro and Ross kept supporting the statement that mass suicide was possible, as did Waco Tribune-Herald reporters.
Anti-cultists and their associates demonized Koresh and the Davidians to such an extent that at the time the ATF operation began, the authorities, operation leaders, and federal agents perceived the Branch Davidians community as an apocalyptic cult in an armed camp, preparing for the final battle of Armageddon against the forces of government, which supposedly embodied satanic Babylon. They envisioned Koresh as a leader of a paramilitary terrorist group that was stockpiling weapons to start a war against the federal government. Representatives of federal authorities were convinced that the Davidians were not going to cooperate during the investigation, that they hated the federal government, were controlled by their fanatical sect leader, and would start a holy war at the very first encounter. Precisely the manipulative actions of the anti-cultists explain why the ATF agents did not consider a non-violent way of resolving the situation. That explains why the agents refused Koresh's invitation to come in person and check the weapons and gun licenses, and why they ignored the opportunity to arrest Koresh outside Mount Carmel while conducting covert surveillance, and instead chose to employ the tactic of dynamic assault on the building where the Davidians resided. That's because in their consciousness, a distorted picture of reality had already been formed and imposed on them by the anti-cultists through manipulative techniques. In federal agents' reality, they were going to search not peaceful civilians, but extremely dangerous criminals, whom the anti-cultists described as terrorists and suicide bombers, without the grim and demonizing images generated by the anti-cultists, exaggerating a possible threat from the Davidians which in fact never existed. It is unlikely that the ATF would have resorted to such extreme measures, but unfortunately, the law enforcement officers had fallen under the influence of anti-cultists, and by the time the operation began, some of their representatives in the operation leadership were already entirely manipulated, largely through Rick Ross.
A raid by federal agents on the ranch where the Branch Davidians resided, with the purpose of searching and detaining their leader, was scheduled for Sunday, February 28, 1993. The operation was officially codenamed Trojan Horse, but later became more widely known as Showtime, as the agents themselves called it. The day before the operation, and on the day of the raid itself, a prearranged massive wave of publications demonizing the Davidians was launched in mass media. Thus, on February 27th and 28th, more than 100 media across the country released materials with almost identical statements, mostly reiterating the core narratives of the anti-cultists' dark rhetoric against the Branch Davidians. All of the media outlets communicated the same groundless accusations by Rick Ross and Mark Bro against the Davidians, posted in the local Waco Tribune-Herald newspaper. During the raid on the ranch, a shootout began, resulting in the deaths of 10 people, including 6 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. David Koresh got wounded. After the federal agents' deaths, the operation came entirely under FBI control, and the case against the Davidians was reclassified as a conspiracy to murder.
And in actuality, the Branch Davidians reacted the way any American would react when his home was broken into by armed terrorists. They first called the police. They dialed 911.
911, what's your emergency?
There are men, 75 men around our building.
Okay, just a moment.
In the tape recordings of these conversations, we can hear the fear and distress of Wayne Martin as he says,
"Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off."
Was another victim, a 2-year-old cult member, was also shot and killed in the gunfire.
And imagine you just finished breakfast and some guy dressed in a black outfit comes with a gun and shoots that member of your family. How is that going to start your day off? What kind of reaction are you as a person going to give to that person trying to come through your door?
The FBI siege of the estate began and lasted 51 days. A massive number of reporters were present on the scene, and everything was broadcast live. Soon, the standoff in Waco became international news, with the whole world watching the events in Texas. Here's how the events in Waco were described by some journalists present at the scene. The FBI assembled what was likely the largest military force ever gathered against civilians in American history. 10 Bradley armored vehicles, 2 Abrams tanks, 4 combat engineering vehicles, 668 agents, plus 6 U.S. Customs officers, 15 U.S. Army personnel, 13 Texas National Guard members, 31 Texas Rangers, 131 officers from the Texas Department of Public Safety, 17 from the McLennan County Sheriff's Office, and 18 Waco police officers. In total, 899 people participated in the operation.
In Waco, Texas, standoff between law officers and occult members of a religious compound.
Called or known as the Branch Davidians.
A heavily armed religious cult near Waco.
3 helicopters, 150 law enforcement officers, some of them from the Houston area.
Dr. Ken Etheridge, he said that he had never seen anything with this magnitude or severity. He said it was like a war zone.
Throughout the siege, negotiations between the FBI and the besieged were ongoing, with the official goal of persuading the Davidians' leader to surrender and lead his people out. During this time, some Davidians left the building, only to be immediately arrested by federal agents. According to video records of their testimonies, everyone who remained in the building for the 51 days of the siege did so voluntarily.
To my family and friends, I'd just like to say I'm fine. I know that you're all worried about us. I'd just like to know that we're fine right now.
I have decided to stay. I don't want to go.
So you're not being held against your will here?
No, I'm not held here as a hostage or anything. If any of us wanted to leave, we can just go now today. I'm here because I wanted to be here.
Sonobi, and I'm not being held here against my will. Don't worry about me. We're gonna be just fine because God's in control.
During the siege, the Davidians were completely isolated. Their phone line was cut almost immediately, and the only people they could communicate with were FBI agents. They could no longer reach out for help elsewhere, and they could only communicate with the media by hanging sheets with written messages in their windows. While the FBI, in turn, continued to consult representatives of the anti-cult gang. Subsequent investigation of the FBI's actions, the study of transcripts of conversations between the FBI and the Davidians, as well as data on the experts contacted by FBI and ATF agents in the Davidian case, revealed that it was the anti-cultist and deprogrammer Rick Ross, who clearly had the most extensive access to both agencies of any person on the cult expert list. He was closely involved with both the ATF and the FBI, and he was apparently listened to more attentively. At the same time, the opinions of other experts who advocated a peaceful way of resolving the situation were not accepted. After all, at the time of the siege, federal agents who had fallen under the influence of anti-cultists did not take the beliefs of the Davidians seriously, so they didn't listen to the advice of theologians, religious scholars, and Bible researchers who tried to convey to law enforcement officers that because of their religious beliefs, the Davidians would not react like criminals, and recommended communicating with the besieged in their language. A number of experts appealed to the FBI not to use forceful tactics against the Davidians because this could ultimately lead to fatalities. However, their suggestions were rejected.
He has no known credentials to support his claim as an expert, yet the FBI allowed him to advise on the course of negotiations while ignoring advice from numerous theologians and genuine psychological counselors.
In parallel with Rick Ross's direct influence on the law enforcement operation, other representatives of the anti-cult group carried out destructive media activities. They appeared as cult experts on various TV channels and intentionally promoted a demonized image of the Davidians in public opinion. One of the representatives of the anti-cult group was Steven Hessen, whom we mentioned earlier.
So he would take people for hours and hours and hours and mesmerize them through hypnosis, through behavior modification techniques and such, and break down their ability to think.
These were the people that we saw over and over in the media as support for the government stories that the Branch Davidians were some evil cult. Mark Breaux is the person who contacted the State Department and the Cult Awareness Network and relayed his allegations. Cult Awareness Network, known by its initials, CAN, targets religious groups around the world for hate campaigns in the media. CAN members always make the same allegations against each group they attack: perverted sex, child abuse, and brainwashing. It reads like a worn-out script. It has been repeated so many times against so many different groups.
The people who lived at Mount Carmel, including children, were never presented to the public as personalities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't share with the media the videos of the Davidians recorded during the siege, so that Americans wouldn't regard them as human beings, feel sympathy for them, and stand up for them. According to James T. Richardson, a sociologist of religion, the dehumanization of those inside Mount Carmel, coupled with the thoroughgoing demonization of Koresh, made it easier for those in authority to develop tactics that seemed organized for disaster. Thus, not only law enforcement officers, but also the public developed a false image of what was really happening in Waco.
And again, you get that demonization. It's like, these are people. As the Davidians were people. The people that died at Mount Carmel were people. They've never been truly humanized until they did the Waco series.
The reason behind all that was going on was one factor that back then neither federal law enforcement agents nor U.S. intelligence officers took into account. This detail, which had a fateful impact on the outcome of the events in Waco and remained unknown to this day, was that representatives of anti-cult organizations used hidden manipulative technologies to influence people's consciousness and subconsciousness. Such information messages that are built on the knowledge of these special psychotechnologies and contain hidden imprints able to bypass critical analysis by consciousness and penetrate directly into the depths of the human subconsciousness were repeatedly disseminated in the media for this very purpose. The anti-cultists needed a large-scale campaign for demonizing the Branch Davidians, and that's why they invested so much effort in dissemination of their false accusations. Therefore, absolutely different articles and videos in seemingly unrelated media contained the same repetitive narratives. Basically, all of this was part of the anti-cultist strategy of psychological manipulation of the public. In fact, anti-cultists were accusing others of what they themselves were actually doing, for they were the ones who were applying mind control and brainwashing techniques. In this way, using methods of psychological influence on the masses with the help of the media, the anti-cultists literally zombified the American people. They intentionally dehumanized the Branch Davidians to instill in people's consciousness a picture that the Davidians were dangerous and harmful to society, although in fact, the most dangerous at that time were the anti-cultists themselves. For the first time, they carried out such a large-scale terrorist act that was repeated in the information field multiple times and had a tremendous impact on all those who had fallen under its attack. As a matter of fact, all people who in one way or another were exposed to the information sourced from anti-cultists ended up infected with hidden destructive imprints. Americans who were following the events in Waco via television or newspapers at that time were subjected to coercive psychological manipulation by the anti-cultists. That's why the majority of people began to believe the descriptions that dehumanized the Davidians and accepted the picture of events presented by anti-cultists as a fact. They had no chance to resist this kind of manipulation, against which virtually the entire population of the planet is defenseless. The hidden manipulative influence by the anti-cultists similarly affected ATF, FBI, and other law enforcement officers, as well as government officials who participated in the Waco events and were in direct close contact with the anti-cultists. The officials were subjected to the highest degree of psychological manipulation and were literally brainwashed by the anti-cultists, so they acted unlawfully against law-abiding American citizens and committed a blatant violation of basic democratic human rights and freedoms. For this very reason, law enforcement officials manifested inhuman aggression against the Davidians ignoring common sense and rejecting an opportunity for a peaceful and fact-based resolution. In turn, the Davidians developed an impression that the federal agents who encircled Mount Carmel were trying to kill them, and today there is considerable evidence that their fears and perception of events were not unfounded.
Listen, Jim, there's nothing that hurts me more than being called a cult leader, all right? If I'm wrong, people like me don't deserve to live, okay?
Listen.
You understand me, Jim? No. You know, don't burn our building down.
No, we won't do that.
Don't shoot us all up. They've got to have that time.
The strange behavior of law enforcement officers and their excessive belligerence towards peaceful citizens who showed no resistance was noticed by experts who hadn't been zombified by anti-cultists and arrived on the scene as consultants. Seeing what was happening, soberly assessing the situation, and foreseeing what the use of aggressive tactics against the Branch Davidians could lead to, they offered quite logical and reasonable options for resolving the conflict in a nonviolent way. But they were not listened to because those in power had already been programmed by the anti-cultists into the violent scenario. The representatives of law enforcement agencies and authorities were sure they were doing the right thing and were acting in an absolutely lawful manner. After all, they believed they were facing enemies, not law-abiding citizens.
I thought the main problem was going to be understanding the psychology of the people inside the compound. But as I got into it, I quickly became aware that the psychology of the people outside the compound was more important to an understanding of what happened. They needed to take control. And the tactical people, in particular, needed to show him who's boss.
We are trying to reinforce to them that we are in charge of the situation, that the compound is under the complete control of the government. It is in fact no longer their compound, that we have the ability to exercise whatever control we want over that compound. And we will do that from various times to demonstrate to them the fact that they are impotent in their ability to control their everyday lives.
I'm prepared to share David Koresh's contention that we should wait on God to resolve this. The FBI is God. It's going to decide how this is going to be resolved.
The federal agents in charge of the operation were confident that they were in control of the situation, but this firm conviction was in fact an illusion instilled by the anti-cultists. In reality, they were no longer in control. It's the anti-cultists who had originally created this situation and held the levers of control. Such manifestations of abnormal behavior are clear signs that perception of all these people had already been distorted at that time by the manipulative technologies of subconscious suggestions used by anti-cultists.
The FBI also employed aggressive psychological tactics during the Waco siege to supposedly force the besieged to voluntarily leave the building. Water and electricity supplies were cut off. Powerful floodlights were aimed at the ranch windows, shining around the clock to prevent the people inside from sleeping. Loudspeakers continuously blared irritating noises and high-volume music. A tank was brought in to clear the area around the building, crushing cars and nearby structures. Clearly, the mere presence of military equipment had a strongly demoralizing effect on the people inside the building.
If they thought that we were all brainwashed and such a bunch of crazies, why would the FBI push David or the rest of us to the limit? Why would you bombard the building day and night with lights and music and noises and wear these people out not knowing how they're going to react?
These pieces of equipment were unarmed, as I understand it, and were contracted. I mean, it was like a good rent-a-car.
A good rent-a-car? A tank going into a building?
Why did the FBI use such methods against peaceful Davidians? Who was behind plotting the tactics of aggressive psychological influence on the besieged people? It's an established fact that the stress escalation strategy employed by the FBI was based on the recommendations of Rick Ross and his accomplices. Moreover, further investigations revealed that the FBI followed the advice of anti-cultists and applied to the Davidians' typical deprogramming techniques, including depriving Koresh and his followers of food, water, and sleep, and repeatedly exposing them to excruciatingly disturbing sounds. In other words, the tactic of aggressive psychological attack on the Davidians was nothing but an attempt of mass deprogramming. It means that the anti-cultists, who had mastered their skills of physical and psychological violence on individuals, in the case of the Davidians, made an attempt to deprogram a whole group of people. This proves that sabotage of peace talks and protracted siege of the building were originally instigated by the anti-cultists, who sought to put an end to the activities of the Branch Davidians by first exposing them to psychological pressure. And when it became obvious that deprogramming methods failed, and on the contrary, only united the people inside the building, the situation took a fatal turn.
The catalyst for initiating the forceful stage was the unfounded conclusion by FBI agents that there was no reason to believe the Davidians would leave the building voluntarily. This was reported to the U.S. Attorney General. It is worth noting that throughout the siege of Mount Carmel, it was repeatedly observed that the actions of the tactical team of federal agents sabotaged the work of their colleagues in the negotiating team. The goal of the negotiators was to build rapport with the Branch Davidians in order to gain their trust. In contrast, the tactical team's efforts were aimed at intimidation and harassment. The negotiators themselves noted that such aggressive tactics undermined their own attempts to gain Koresh's trust and achieve a peaceful surrender of the Davidians. Moreover, the FBI actually made their statement that further negotiations were pointless after an agreement had been reached between their agents and the leader of the Davidians, David Koresh, that all of the Davidians would voluntarily leave the building immediately after Koresh would write his interpretation of the 7 seals of the apocalypse.
Definitely, those people were perfectly aware that the law enforcement officers intended to stop the activities of the Branch Davidian as a religious group. They realized that as soon as they would exit the building, they would be immediately arrested, and their children would be taken away by social services. Despite that, they agreed to come out, while the media promoted the anti-cultist mindset that Davidians were an allegedly dangerous suicidal cult. In fact, those people clearly demonstrated by their actions that they wanted to live, and they fought for their lives to the end.
On April the 14th, there was a major breakthrough, and that breakthrough was David Koresh's letter to me, which I promptly gave to the FBI, that said that he'd received his mission, that he was working on writing his interpretation of the 7 seals, and that everyone inside was relieved that they didn't have to die now, that the prophecies were not being fulfilled now, and that this would be resolved.
He waited 51 days, and then he said, the word came to him and said, write, and he wrote. This was brought out the day of the fire by one of the survivors. He was keeping his promise of April 14th. We believe they would have all come out safely.
What I was faced with was a situation where the negotiators said, we think we have reached an impasse. Nobody else is coming out voluntarily. We looked at the entire situation and we made the best judgment we could. I'm very satisfied that in the information furnished to me by the FBI, I was informed.
A key factor that significantly influenced the decision-makers was a speculation that the children in the building were in danger, and that they had allegedly already been victims of abuse. These claims were fueled by the series of articles under the collective title, The Sinful Messiah, co-authored by Mark Bro and Rick Ross. Based on the belief formed under the influence of these anti-cultist narratives promoted in the media, the U.S. Attorney General decided that it was necessary to begin an operation to free the hostages and assault the building where Davidians and their children were located.
The Bureau, time after time, asked Koresh for some evidence that the children were okay. We did not receive verification that the children were okay. We had concerns for the children.
Their concern were the children. They had candy bars in their pockets to give out.
Chocolate for the kids. Wow.
The Davidians themselves had no idea that an attack was being planned against them. On the contrary, they believed they had made progress in the negotiations and that the ordeal they had been enduring would soon come to an end. They didn't know they had only one day left to live.
Hello? Hello? No, honey, nobody's gonna come and kill you.
Are they gonna come and kill me?
No. No. Nobody's coming.
Final day. On the 51st day of the siege, on April 19th, 1993, armored vehicles were sent to the building where the besieged were located. The vehicles began meticulously demolishing parts of the structure and releasing a special gas inside.
The gas supplies a number of irritants to the nostrils, to the eyes, to the skin. Just touching to the skin can be extremely painful. You can have certain symptoms of nausea. You can have certain symptoms of inflammation with regard to membranes. So it is extremely uncomfortable.
They would be coughing, choking. They would probably be unconscious. Some of them would probably be dead. Some would be basically inert. They may still be alive, they may still be breathing, but they're not going to be doing anything.
The falling walls, destroyed by armored vehicles, effectively killed some of the Davidians, as evidenced by forensic reports. The tank repeatedly drove over their bodies, tearing them apart. Then, a fire broke out in the building, in 3 different places, simultaneously. The officer in charge of the operation refused to allow firefighters to approach the scene, claiming that the Davidians might shoot them.
This looks like probably the fire chief and fire marshals, and we have, at this point, 2 fires.
When the fire did start and the fire trucks did arrive, I didn't let them in. I held them at the checkpoint because I didn't want the firemen to drive into gunfire. I just wasn't going to permit it. It's a terrible thing, and a very terrible decision to have to make.
This is not the way to end this. Lead your people out, David. Be a messiah, not a destroyer.
After American citizens were poisoned with gas and their house was set on fire, the authorities kept shouting, "Get your people out, David," even though they knew very well that there was no one to come out. Many were already dead at that moment, and the rest were burning alive. This show was staged by the representatives of the law enforcement agencies for the media and possible future investigations in order to avoid responsibility. Mount Carmel burned to the ground. 76 people died, including 25 children, some of whom were infants and toddlers under the age of 3. The organization leader, David Koresh, was found with a gunshot wound in his head. The causes of the fire remain undetermined to this day. Less than a month later, bulldozers destroyed the remnants of the burned buildings, which critics of the government regarded as an attempt to cover up the circumstances of people's deaths. A year after those events, representative of the anti-cult gang and deprogrammer Rick Ross, who had a dramatic impact that contributed to the tragic outcome of the Waco events, was already describing David Koresh's personality and characterizing the Branch Davidians in new media, reports in the following way.
Even after the deaths of those people and their children, anti-cultists continued their smear campaign to demonize the Branch Davidians, aiming to cement the image of sinister cultists, psychopaths, and suicides in public consciousness. They used this horrific tragedy for their own ends, turning it into an informational terrorist act, essentially an act of intimidation for all other religious communities and a precedent for undermining public trust in law enforcement agencies of our country, which were supposed to guarantee lawfulness and order in society instead of causing mass deaths. Since the FBI controlled the flow of information about the Davidians in the media, they were never able to share their own version of events with the American public. All Americans have seen in the media are images of the crazy David Koresh and the same repeated unsubstantiated accusations by anti-cultists. Dehumanization of the Davidians, combined with the anti-cultists' manipulative techniques, turned the American citizens into a faceless group of religious fanatics. Such media coverage of the events produced an illusory perception that the deaths of American citizens were not a ground for public protests against excessive force used against them. Therefore, until the very last moment, the entire country was silently observing the events in Waco as yet another reality show until those people and their children burned alive in the fire. Realization of what had happened started coming much later, and not to all observers of this terrorist attack organized by anti-cultists. Even now, in articles about those events, you might see the phrase, "About 80 cultists died," not people, not American citizens, but cultists. This terminology is used by anti-cultists and their supporters to ensure that the deaths of those people do not evoke sympathy or regret in you. It is meant to absolve you, as a society, of guilt for allowing this to happen, and for letting the actual perpetrators of this mass murder go unpunished. The Waco tragedy, the terrible death of all those innocent people and their children, is essentially an act of genocide carried out by anti-cultists through representatives of the authorities and law enforcement agencies. And in this case, those who committed it are no different from the Nazis during World War II.
When someone's suspected of a crime, even if it's child abuse, even if it's capital murder, we give them a trial. A jury finds them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt before they go to sentencing. Then a jury or a judge sentences them, and an appeals court makes sure the trial was conducted with due process. And then and only then do we kill them. We don't kill them first, like happened in Waco on April the 19th.
Aftermath of the Waco tragedy.
And I'll remind the American people one more time that during that entire time, those 6 hours, and indeed those 51 days, the FBI never fired one shot at the Davidians.
David Koresh and the Davidians set fire to themselves and committed suicide. The government did not do that.
Assertion to me that the media and that the government has made a kind of blanket declaration that the Branch Davidians committed, quote, mass suicide, to equate it to a Jonestown, Guyana suicide.
The Bureau's efforts were ultimately unavailing because the individual with whom they were dealing, David Koresh, was dangerous, irrational, and probably insane. I was, frankly, surprised would be a mild word, to say that anyone that would suggest that the Attorney General should resign because some religious fanatics murdered themselves.
The Waco tragedy became one of the most significant and bloody failures of American intelligence agencies in the country's history. Being under the influence of manipulative techniques by anti-cultists, federal agents committed physical, psychological, constitutional, and judicial violence against American citizens whom they regarded as members of a dangerous cult, thereby despising them and not considering them humans. To this day, this event remains the most severe case of Americans confronting Americans since the Civil War between the North and the South, and it happened as a result of manipulative actions of anti-cultists. American citizens who followed the events in real time were divided by contradictory media reports, actually the result of orchestrated information terrorism by anti-cultists into those who regarded the Branch Davidians as an insane, suicidal cult, and those who believed the deaths of almost 100 people were due to reckless actions of federal authorities. However, the majority of the American public became angry at the FBI. Federal agents were seen as demons, uncontrollably killing peaceful citizens. Later on, among peaceful citizens there emerged Avengers, that is, new terrorists created by the media's informational acts of terrorism, who were actually yet another victims of the anti-cultists.